Good morning. It's 8 o'clock. We have a totally full day, so let's try to have a seat and get started to our first in-person meeting in like 2 or 3 years. Woo-hoo! Welcome back. Isn't it so exciting to be here? Thank you all for making time to come to this consensus conference. We're hoping that we will move the science forward a little bit. Here are a few slides about getting CME that we have to show. So here you are. Okay. So this year's conference. So I know that there's not enough tables for all the people. If there are more people than tables, we will figure it out. Okay? All right. So thank you all for coming. First, I wanted to introduce our committee. We have been very hard at work all year. If you guys could all stand up, please, Marquita. Thank you so much. We were all under the guiding eye of Melissa, who is with SAEM, and she deserves a lot of congratulations for herding all of these cats. So let's start with things that you probably already know, but let's put us all on the same page. What does racism in medicine mean? That's what we're going to talk about all day today, right? It means that even though these two young ladies are twins, the young woman perceived as a black person, she is much less likely to receive positive interactions with the healthcare systems, much less likely to be taken seriously, and much less likely to have state-of-the-art healthcare where she lives. It means that her pain will often go unaddressed. Black men wait longer for pain medication when they show up to the emergency department with a long bone fracture. Black children with appendicitis more often go without pain medication than white children. And we know that sickle cell patients wait longer, have a less acute ESI score, and are more likely to have their complaint dismissed. Right? We've seen this. When a black woman shows up to an emergency department with crushing chest pain, she is 50% less likely to receive any life-saving intervention for her complaint. Black and Mexican men who arrive at the emergency department with chest pain wait longer for their initial EKG. And we may notice during their stay that they're hypertensive. How many of us in medical school were taught a race-based prescribing method, that black people shouldn't get these medications and white people should only get these medications? Why did it take until 2022, so January, a few months ago, for us to realize that there was no benefit to this race-based approach to prescribing medication? Black women are 3 to 4 times more likely to die during pregnancy than white women. And when a black woman has a child, she is more likely to put that child in the ground within the first year of life, and that risk is increased if the baby's doctor is white. These concepts have just hit mainstream media. How many saw The Color of Care on Smithsonian about a week ago by Oprah? Did anybody see it? It was on the Smithsonian Network about a week ago, May 1st, and she talked about COVID and the outcomes, race-based outcomes with COVID. But it's nothing new to us, right? We know that black patients did not do as well as white patients, and they were dying disproportionately. So when we compare COVID to HIV, some of us remember that. Some of us are too young to remember the epidemic of the 80s. When AIDS was sweeping the nation, the issue of health disparities was the first time it reached the national stage. And that year, the Department of Health and Human Services, under the guiding eye of Margaret Heckler, released a report that had these unbelievable truths, that there was actually racial disparity in outcomes, not just with HIV and AIDS, but with cancer and heart attacks and diabetes. The report showed in excruciating detail that people of color were less likely to receive state-of-the-art interventions, state-of-the-art medications. They were less likely to do as well because of this. So one has to ask, is it the phenotype of race, or is it the fact that they are black themselves that is at play? Is it that they are black, or is it the cumulative effect of a lifetime of toxic stress that leads to these poor outcomes? Or perhaps, is it bias and stereotyping that leads to these outcomes? And what role do we play in propagating this? George Floyd's dying under Derek Chauvin's knee led to the biggest outcry of racial injustice in the US in generations. And as a specialty, as the specialty that interfaces with the public, as the specialty that addresses societal barriers and inadequacies, what can we do? That's what we're going to try to discover today. So a couple of definitions, just to make sure that we're all on the same page. It's hard to define race, and admittedly, this is not really a medical problem, it's really a societal problem. But racism is assigning social meaning to observable characteristics, while ethnicity encompasses both biological and non-biological differences, and can be expressed as at structural and individual levels. So when we think about institutional racism, we think about the policies and the procedures and the laws that exist. And when we think about personal racism, we think about discrimination and prejudice, one being the thoughts that somebody has, and one being that the actions that somebody takes. In our education systems in medical school and in residency, are we victims of the same mythology that propagated slavery hundreds of years ago? How can we change the outcomes, and how can we measure these changes? The research pillar will address this. While education reform is a great place to start and can change the culture for future physicians, what does that actually look like? And what about faculty and leadership development? What are they, and how do we afford equity in terms of opportunities for research, public speaking, and publication, as well as promotion? So I'll turn it over to Jeff to talk about our day.
So we wanted to remind you that the goal of this conference is actually to create the research agenda. And what that means is that we're not trying to answer questions that we create. We're actually trying to define which questions are going to actually advance our specialty overall and are going to refine and document what evidence gaps exist to advance anti-racism in emergency medicine. And some of these questions are much broader domains than the research questions that will need to be generated. And other questions are much more specific to elements of research. What that means is that we want you all to try and expand your mind in terms of which questions are going to be the ones that we're going to focus on going forward for emergency medicine. So, now you know why you're here. And the question is how do we do this? Well, we're going to start off with a panel discussion with Ava Pierce, Bernie Lopez, and Ian Martin, who are going to answer two main questions that you can see up there. We're going to have a brief break after that. We're going to have a summary of the prior conference that occurred last year by Michelle Lynn and Margaret Samuels-Callow. And then we're going to have our first breakout session. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Almaz Desi to talk briefly about how the breakout sessions are going to work.
Good morning. So I will explain just a little bit about the bulk of the day, which is our breakout session. So we're going to have a morning breakout for 2.5 hours, lunch and a little bit of a break, and then an afternoon breakout for 2.5 hours. We have 3 groups: healthcare research, education, and leadership, and everyone has selected at least one group. We'd like you to attend one group in the morning and a different group in the afternoon. If you can only attend one, that's okay, but everyone here should be planning to attend at least one, hopefully 2 separate, different breakout groups. Here are your breakout groups leaders listed, and I just want to acknowledge these folks for having done a tremendous amount of work for the last few months preparing for this event today, where we're going to do the bulk of our work. So just to catch you all up who haven't been involved for the last few months, what we've been doing. So before today, those breakout group leaders have been leading these working groups for the last several months, who have been looking at their topic, leadership for example, and reviewing the literature out there on that topic in emergency medicine. So they spent a great deal of time kind of combing through the literature and identifying a list of questions that are relevant to this topic within their domain. And they've gone back and forth and done this over several months and generated a great list of questions that we can start with for a rich discussion today. Hopefully you all received those questions in your pre-conference survey. We had about a third of you vote in that SurveyMonkey to express your agreement or disagreement and how important those questions were in the various domains. So we will present those results today at the conference, and that was kind of our round one. In the morning and afternoon sessions, we will break out into those 3 groups with your breakout leaders. They will present to you those results we have so far. I will tell you that we did not reach consensus really on anything yet. So we have plenty to talk about. So this is where you all come in. We want everybody to participate. We want everyone's voices to be heard. Please meet each other and have this rich discussion that we're all here for today. And we will repeat the process in the afternoon. And we're going to vote, and I'll explain the voting process in the next slide. And then post-conference, we will probably be doing another survey to either kind of clean up the questions or do a third sort of round of consensus building based on these discussions, depending on what we reach today. So the structure of the breakouts that we'll do in the morning and afternoon, your breakout leaders are all prepped to do this. We thank them again and again and again for all their hard work, but they will review sort of the background literature. I think many of you were able to review some of those articles in advance. We'll talk about what the results were thus far from our round one pre-conference survey, and then it's time for the discussion. So we have an hour and 45 minutes basically to discuss the various questions. And we'd like you to focus on really what are the pros and cons of each question. What is missing from these questions? You're welcome to propose alternatives or different wordings, revise them, talk about what's important and what's not important to you. Talk about what's already been reviewed in the emerging medicine literature and what hasn't. And within that discussion, we also really want to focus on not just where the gaps are, but how to answer those gaps. So we'd like to focus a great deal of the discussion on feasibility of answering these questions. Because if something is a priority, but it's not feasible to study, then it's not useful for us to continue in our discussion. So please consider that as well. We're talking about funding sources, what sort of research networks are required to answer some of these questions, resources, infrastructure, and so forth. So we want that included in the discussion as well. And then at the end of each session, we will do a vote. So the voting is the fun part, a little bit interactive, but at the end of each session, we'll have 15, 20 minutes to go around the room and vote. So you'll be in a room, we'll have each question that we've come to some decision about thus far on a big pad of paper, and everyone gets to be a funder now. So you're going to get some stickers, and the stickers are total $240. That is your funding amount today, and you are going to vote by placing your stickers on the questions that you think are important. So you'll have red stickers, 3 of them, that are worth $50, green stickers, 3 of them that are worth $20, yellow stickers, 3 of them that are worth $10. For a total of $240, you can allot to your research question priorities. You can put them all on one page. You can distribute them as you see important. And then at the end of the day, we will be looking at those totals to sort of see where we've reached consensus. You'll get $240 for the morning, $240 for the afternoon to fund your research priorities. And these are the stickers you're going to get. So 50 for red, 20 for green, 10 for yellow. And we'd like this activity to be done in silence as part of the consensus methodology. Like, we have the rich discussion, we've learned what other people think, and then we can walk around the room and think for ourselves and vote. All right, and then your breakout room leaders will be able to answer any questions in the room.
So at lunch, Dr. Cheryl Heron will be talking, and if you all don't know who Dr. Cheryl Heron is, she's the professor and vice chair for faculty equity, engagement, and empowerment for emergency medicine at Emory, the assistant dean for community engagement, equity, and inclusion for the School of Medicine, the chief diversity officer for the NEA project. She's also one of the people that founded Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in Emergency Medicine, being one of the founders of the Academy for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in Emergency Medicine at SAEM, and she's going to be spectacular. The afternoon breakout session is going to happen from 1:30 to 4. Similar structure. I highlighted the differences here. You can see that basically the big difference is that the leaders, instead of summarizing the overall literature, are going to be summarizing the morning session so that people have that information. And then we stole a little bit of that time in terms of adjusting the other times. But at the end, the idea is to collate and present the results, and that will be what actually happens after a brief break, is that there will be a summary from each of the breakout groups, so 15 minutes from each breakout group to summarize which questions it is that they came up with, and then some closing remarks from the co-chairs. One thing that I think that a lot of people are doing now is they're doing their thank yous up front, because we know that some of you may duck out just a little bit early. With that being said, one of the things that Neha and I wanted to do was make sure to thank our amazing team. There is no question that the three women that are standing up here next to Neha have done an absolutely amazing job of making sure that we stay on task and put together a phenomenal conference for you. We also wanted to thank all the breakout team leaders. You can see it's a large group right here, and I can't tell you the number of Zoom calls that we went through to arrive on how we're doing things appropriately. And if you could join me in thanking them. I know it's a little early for this, but thank you. Our biggest thank you, however, goes to Melissa McMillian and the SAEM staff, and that actually includes our medical student volunteers who are sitting in the blue jackets who have volunteered to help us out. With that being said, I'm going to turn this over to Esther Chen, who's going to introduce you to the panelists.
Good morning. Hi, good morning, and thank you all for participating in this year's Consensus Conference. I am Esther Chen. I'm from the University of California, San Francisco, and I am joined by my colleague and friend, Dr. Marquita Norman from University of Texas at Southwestern Medical Center. And to kick off our conference, we have invited 3 leaders in emergency medicine who I think none of you need any introductions. But we invited them to share their experiences with fighting racism throughout their academic careers. And it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Ava Pierce, who's a professor of emergency medicine at the University of Texas Southwestern Medical Center, the associate chair for diversity and inclusion within the department, a current member of the board of SAEM, and the former president and development officer of SAEM's Academy for Diversity and Inclusion in Emergency Medicine. And also, I'd like to introduce Dr. Ian Martin, who's a professor with tenure of emergency medicine and internal medicine at the Medical College of Wisconsin, the system chair of the Department of Emergency Medicine, and of course, a former president of SAEM. And then Dr. Bernard Lopez, who's a professor of emergency medicine at Thomas Jefferson University, the executive vice chair of the Department of Emergency Medicine, and for the university, the associate provost for diversity and inclusion and associate dean for diversity and community engagement for the university. He has also served as the former president of SAEM's Academy for Diversity and Inclusion in Emergency Medicine. Thank you to our distinguished panelists for contributing to this discussion. We will start with some questions for each panelist, and we've set up a Google Doc with a QR code there for you to write in your questions as we go along. And you'll see that we also have 2 microphones set up at both ends of the room, and so you'll have an opportunity to ask your questions directly if you just come up to the microphones a little bit later. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Norman.
Thank you, Dr. Chen. So we'll start off with the first question regarding your personal path. Please summarize your career path, commenting on the impact that racism had on your career path and how you overcame racism to become so successful. So, Dr. Martin?
Well, thank you, Dr. Norman, for that question, and thank you for the introduction there. And thank you for the opportunity to sit on this panel, and it's really great to see so many people many of whom I know and many of whom I look forward to meeting. It's really great to be back in person after 3 years of being apart. I have, 40 minutes? No, so yeah, I'll tell you a little bit of my story and weave in some of how bias and racism has probably impacted me. Sometimes, mostly subtle, but sometimes overt. So I'm a public school kid, grew up in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., and graduated second in my class of about 500 students. And my girlfriend was actually number one. But despite that, I remember and going to the guidance counselor and talking about colleges, and I told her how much I wanted to go to Duke. Duke was my top choice I wanted to go to, and all the schools I was applying to, Ivies and Stanford and such. And I remember her saying to me, maybe not Duke, maybe you should think about Duquesne. And no insult to anyone who went to Duquesne, but clearly different calibers of school, which I thought was curious at the time. Fortunately, I didn't listen to her, went forward with my list, and ended up going to Duke, actually. And so that's one of my earliest recollections of how sometimes the advice that we get from others can be biased against. Clearly, I was right, and she wasn't in that particular case. Went on to Duke, where I majored in biology and Russian with the plan of going to medical school. It's a great experience, but I will say there was little support for students like me who were interested in going to medicine, despite the fact that a quarter of the class typically went into medicine. And I will say that was probably the first time I actually encountered imposter syndrome. That's something we think that just people of color deal with, but the reality is all of us deal with some degree of imposter syndrome for sure. But despite some of the challenges in colleges, I certainly persevered and went on and went to medical school, and went to Medical College of Pennsylvania in Hahnemann. And a lot actually my choice of going there was it was an extraordinarily supportive environment where they really put their money where their mouth was. And half my tuition was paid as a student of color who happened to have residence in the state of Pennsylvania at that particular time. Decided that I wanted to do emergency medicine and internal medicine, and went on to match in my first choice at University of Maryland. I see some old friends from the University of Maryland there, where I ultimately became chief resident. And I did find that to also be a fairly supportive environment where there were good mentors and good role models. At the time I was there, the dean of the medical school was an African-American man. But certainly still battled with imposter syndrome. I asked myself the question all the time, was I really supposed to be a resident physician? Was I really supposed to be a chief resident? Was I really supposed to get my first choice? But I persevered on for sure. My first faculty job, I went full circle back to Duke. And at that time, it's funny to look back and say how I was satisfied. And again, this speaks to the then lack of mentorship, to be an assistant professor for the rest of my career, to be a bedside clinical educator. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but to think of how my career unfolded, how far off I was. Became the founding program director for the Global Health Fellowship Program, which lives on, has trained a number of fellows across time. But really didn't get a ton of mentorship or sponsorship when I was at that institution. But was recruited away to UNC Chapel Hill, and where I really think I hit my stride as a person of color in academic medicine. Got lots of good mentorship for folks that I still have relationships with who really taught me how to extract the academic currency that the dean cares about to get you promoted and move along in your career. Held a number of leadership roles while I was at UNC. I helped lead the residency program, started another fellowship program in global emergency medicine, was a division chief, led one of our offices of international activities, and led a career development program for people of color, which I actually had gone through myself. But really importantly, I did a career development program called the ACCLAIM program, and I can't remember exactly what it stands for right at this moment, but the point was the institution was wanting to further support and advance the careers of those who they saw now as mid-level leaders that they thought had potential to be senior level leaders. And it's through that program that I got the idea to go to business school. And I'm really grateful for that experience because it planted the seed of, well, why can't I be a chair? And that was the first time in my entire career I ever thought, and I'm pretty far along at that point, why shouldn't I be a chair? Why can't I be a chair? And it really changed my thinking. So I took that leap of faith. I dipped my toe in the water, and I got my first chair job at West Virginia University, which was certainly a leap of faith. I was there for 2 years. I was their first external recruit who really turned the department in an academic direction. Learned a lot of incredibly important lessons there, both positive and negative, but was ultimately able to leverage that for even greater leadership things in my next job, which is here at MCW, and I've been here for 4 years now. And we've certainly been through a period of accelerated growth, and this has been a very supportive environment for me personally, with lots of active sponsorship and mentorship from many, including the dean and the president. So I would certainly say that, across my career, bias has certainly crept in, many times in very subtle ways, starting way back in high school, being dissuaded from going from a top-tier school for whatever reason. Certainly across time, not being fully encouraged to realize my dreams and my aspirations, again, sometimes for unclear reasons. Certainly battling with imposter syndrome, and I bet a lot of people in this room battle with that, where you feel like you don't belong and you don't deserve these things, and we really do. So I've managed to get through it by, number one, a lot of self-belief. That's been critically important, a lot of hard work, actively finding mentors and sponsors who could help me realize my dreams, that had the belief in my potential. So that's my story.
Thank you, Dr. Martin. Dr. Lopez?
So when I was asked this question, I had to actually think about this for a little bit because I really never had the chance to think about how racism impacted me personally, mostly because I shrugged off whatever came my way growing up. In my diversity roles, racism, bias clearly is a part of what it is that I do. I think about when I was in middle school age, and how I got picked on for my Asianness is really what it was. And I think what that probably did was, well, it certainly taught me some really good life skills, survival skills, whether it be, verbal survival, whether it be physical survival. You just had to kind of figure out how to make things work. And, fast forward to my adult life, probably served me well there. So when I think about, my own personal experience with bias, I think back to that time. Don't think I experienced it too much in my professional career. Yeah, where do I see it? Patient care, being the target of, although I'm not sure whether it's I'm a target because I'm Asian or I'm a target because I'm an emergency physician in the emergency department. So it's really hard to say. And clearly, I think we see it, typically not overt bias, but it could be unconscious bias, implicit bias. I think we see it in the emergency department. So I've had my experiences that way. My career path, and I'm going to really kind of focus it on my work in diversity, equity, and inclusion. So part of by a virtue of being around for as long as I've been around, I've had the chance to really develop leadership roles in emergency medicine. I think about all my titles, and probably you're not supposed to do your career this way. I was a basic science researcher to start out. Then I did clinical research. Then I was the director for clinical research. Then I was the vice chair for academic affairs. I became the residency program director. I became the executive vice chair, and then I have all these other jobs that I've had. I was student affairs dean, and mind you, these are all concurrent. It's not one right after the other. And I think we all know what that's like to have multiple titles. That's probably just who we are as emergency physicians. So back in 2013, I said, you know what, I really have to focus on my emergency medicine career. I'm going to be the vice chair. I'm going to focus on running the department. This was April of 2013. So I'm settling into my job. It's perhaps 4 months later, and our vice dean for faculty affairs, she's on my schedule. It was middle of July, and I'm wondering, what did I do wrong? What did I say? I'm in trouble for something. Well, she asked me to become the dean for diversity in the medical school. Now, I think I'm a nice guy. I try to treat people well. I had no experience whatsoever in the world of DE&I. Well, she told me, yeah, you can shape the university, you can shape the medical school, diversity, inclusion, that sort of thing. Somewhere she mentioned in there, we have an LCME visit coming in a year and a half. We don't have anything. I missed it. I'm thinking, oh, great title, what am I getting into? And then I find out you're in charge of the diversity aspect of our LCME visit. By the way, we don't have a whole lot of stuff. We're not a particularly diverse institution, as I kind of knew, and then when I saw the numbers, so I'm the person that has to lead this. And I'll tell you, the first year and a half getting to the LCME visit, I wondered why I actually took this job. I think they gave it to me largely because I'd been at the institution for a long time. I knew people. Being student affairs dean, being vice chair in emergency medicine, I knew a lot of people. So I think they got me into this role to really get us through the LCME visit. So LCME comes. Somehow we managed to do okay on that part. So my work is done. And I think, well, great, do I get to quit this job now and go back to emergency medicine? But I didn't quit it. I actually, getting over the LCME visit is a big deal. That's one thing out of the way. But I really got to see that, so in my job, I get to help drive diversity. I get to set the stage for diversity, equity, and inclusion in the medical school. So wait, I get to fight discrimination, that's my job? And to me, that was a great thing. I went about my next career, my current career in diversity, equity, and inclusion, and I just did it the same way I did my emergency medicine career. It's becoming educated, it's publishing, it's speaking, it's going to conferences. So when I think about the effect of racism, and not just racism, but all the different biases that we encounter, that affected me in a great way in that I had a chance in my career, I still have my chance in a career. We have another LCME visit coming next year, so I don't get to leave my job anytime soon, but I have a chance to really shape the way the medical school, now our university, our entire enterprise, because I'm involved at the enterprise level as well, but I get a chance to shape the diversity of our organization. Really most importantly, how we can be most inclusive. That's good for us in our environment, and ultimately it's good for patient care. So I think that's how racism has really affected my career.
Thank you, Dr. Lopez. Dr. Pierce?
So I guess I'll start my journey at the beginning of my academic career. As a clerkship director, I witnessed microaggressions that my medical students were encountering. And I realized, I had encountered those same microaggressions, but I dealt with them. But when it got to the point where they were affecting my students and how I saw the bias that they were affecting, it really encouraged me to pivot my career and move into the DEI space. I also looked at the healthcare disparities that the patients were experiencing and wondered, what can I do? How can I make a difference? And so then I completed the AAMC's Healthcare Executive Diversity and Inclusion Certificate Program, where I met Dr. Lopez, and began this journey in the DEI space. And so, as I look around the room, I see people who I've worked with, people who are on this journey, and I think we all just want to move that needle forward. I did not have mentorship when I initially started within my own program. There were very few URMs that looked like me there. And so I wanted to be the person that was that change agent for the next group of academic physicians that were going to come around and exist. I then did more education through the AAMC. I became active in ADIM, where we worked on education. We looked at how can we change policies, what can we do at the organizational level, what can we do at the institutional level. And so that's what I encourage everyone to just look at education, look at what you can do, look at next steps in action and how we can change things.
Thank you, Dr. Pierce. So our next question is regarding vision for the future. As you reflect on the impact of racism on academic physicians, what do you think needs to change? What efforts or initiatives might make the biggest impact in emergency medicine? And I'm going to start off with Dr. Lopez on this one.
So I think the biggest change that needs to happen is our education. Right? When we think about all the things that go into racism, this is not something that we're typically well educated on. Right? So we spend most of our education on the science of emergency medicine, maybe a little bit of the art of emergency medicine, and rightfully so. What's the best way to diagnose? What's the best way to care for patient? I think rightfully so, but I think we need to spend a little bit more time on education in really all things race and racism. Without that understanding, to me, we do things, but without understanding fully why we do what it is that we do, why it's important to be in this space, why it's important to consider this, unless we fully understand, or at least better understand and are better educated, I don't think we're going to get very far. I think about, again, my career in diversity, equity, and inclusion. I've learned things about racism in the last 9 years that I've been doing this that I should have been taught this in grade school, in high school. And I was just shocked at how much I didn't know. And this is not because I don't care, but these were things that were never taught, things that were, I don't know, maybe hidden from our education. So when I start seeing that, I think, well, if I'm not educated in this area, and this is the area that I spend most of my time, what about everybody else? So I think to make real change, we really have to make the effort to be as educated as we can be. It needs to be a deeper understanding, not just a superficial knowledge, but I think we really have to become educated.
Thank you. Dr. Pierce?
I will agree with you, Dr. Lopez. I think first we must call it out and say it's racism. We must name it and admit that it is what it is. And then education is next. Education for ourselves individually, educations for our learners, our medical students, our residents. We have to teach this next generation about this racism so that we can stop this discrimination that exists. And then advocacy. We can't just educate. I think we have to look at the policies that are in place. We have to make things where we can document discrimination and that people will not be discouraged from that reporting.
So I completely agree with my two colleagues here, and what I would add to this is that I think we have to build that critical mass of URM students. We got to get more students of color into our medical schools, hopefully to at least the proportion of the groups that they come from as represented in the general population. We've got to increase the number of those students who choose emergency medicine. We know we have a huge gap there, and then we've got to recruit them into academic EM as a faculty member and cultivate them into leaders. And that's really important, number one, to create community, to create a critical mass. But also we know that students of color, faculty of color, leaders of color tend to focus on these issues more and recognize these issues more. I'm glad to see a lot, looking out in the audience, there are a lot of allies in this room, and that's critically important too. So in doing that, we also help build a workforce that is much more similar to the patients that we actually all take care of every day, which is a critical part of the education and calling out, so on and so forth. The other thing is, though, the data is pretty clear. We know that, Black patients get better care when they're cared for by Black physicians. So I would say, in adding to my colleagues, we certainly have to move the needle on the recruitment and retention of URMs in medicine.
So if you can think of one pearl or takeaway for the audience for what academic emergency physicians can do to fight racism, what would it be? Dr. Pierce?
One thing I will think about is, as we look at research, I think these decisions need to be data-driven. So I would encourage you to look at your quality data, look at your metrics, how are our patients being affected, and make these decisions be evidence-based.
I would say call it out, which you already said, but that's critically important. It takes a lot of courage to do that, for sure. Advocate for our patients. That might be the most important front that we would fight this war on, because they're the most vulnerable. And since we're academicians, I think it's critically important, and I know this is why this conference is even happening today, to study it. And then these conversations are about the data and how racism impacts the quality of care and impacts retention of students or faculty, how it impacts the business of healthcare as well. So I think those are some of the things that I would certainly say.
On an individual level, I would say my pearl would be have a growth mindset in this area. I'm guessing that since you're here today and you're planning to spend much of your Tuesday here, you've got a growth mindset in this area. But I say really have a growth mindset in this area. This is an extremely difficult topic to deal with. Certainly on a personal level, it can be really challenging when you look in at yourself and you say, wow, I might have my own biases. And it's often painful to look at, but know that that's part of it. So having a growth mindset, I think, is important on an individual level, because it allows you to have an open mind, learn more, try to figure out better ways to do things. I think just on a bigger level, the other pearl would be set up structures and foundations. So, we have to do our part individually, but it's really difficult to make big change on an individual level. Again, it's not to say that you don't do it, but I think it's really important to set up foundation, structure, committees, policies, educational programs, that sort of thing. So those are the two things I would suggest.
Thank you. So at this time, we want to open up questions to the audience. I would like to, there's some really great questions on the Google Doc. Maybe we can start. I'm going to just consolidate a few of these, but there's a question for our panelists about junior faculty members. So how can junior faculty contribute to a culture of change with respect to DEI, especially if they are new to the institution? And perhaps you could touch on also, how do you get administrative buy-in for DEI efforts at either department level or School of Medicine level or university level? It's a loaded question there.
It is a really good question. So I would say you got to really make your leaders care about this if they don't already care about it. Because in the end, the leaders set the priority, they create the culture, they allocate resources, so on and so forth. And you might say, well, how do you do that? And I think it goes back to my point about, as academicians, we need to study this so that we have data that is objective. So it's about data and numbers and not about politics, which is sometimes where these important conversations get thrown and mixed up, and then people shut down, for sure. So I think that's a critically important part, using the data to make a case for why this is important to the department if the leader or leaders don't already think it to be an important thing. I think the other one is creating, sort of aligning yourself with others who have similar interests, right? So hopefully this person is in a department where he or she is not the only faculty member of color, but if so, band together with staff members or even residents or fellows or even faculty outside of the Department of Emergency Medicine. One of our, actually, what immediately came to mind is one of my new faculty members who's part-time but has a passion around this. And I would like to say I'm one of the chairs who probably pays a little bit more attention to this, have a lot to learn and grow. But she put together a committee in our department. It's a URIM and allyship committee. And she's only a year and a half into her tenure with us, but asked could she do this. Of course I said yes. And we have any number of faculty, mostly allies, mostly non-URM members who are part of this. And we give them resources, and it's pretty amazing how she has inserted the important work and counsel of that group into everything that we're doing across all our missions in emergency medicine.
If I could. So, the buy-in from key leadership. In my work, that's what I spend most of my time doing, is trying to figure out how do you get the key people who can make this happen to see it in a certain way. Right? So when we have strategic planning, this and that. Some of our strategic planning is how do we approach certain leaders? What is the best way to talk with a certain leader? When you say get them to see it your way, I think it's understanding what the leaders' priorities are and how to work that in. So you may not see it my way, but I know what's important to you. So if it's money that's important to them, you have to figure out how you get people to see how diversity, equity, and inclusion is a good thing. It's a good thing to have an inclusive environment, because if you lose a faculty member, that's going to cost you X thousands of dollars to hire a new one. So maybe the leader doesn't see it the way I do, but they certainly see what the effects are and where there might be benefits. So how do you get them? You have to get to know people. I think you have to get to know them, beyond just, I have this diversity initiative that I need you to do. You've got to get to know them, understand them, and then try to figure out, well, what are their priorities and how do you work that together?
And I guess similarly, what we've done at our institution is to have that group of junior faculty work with faculty throughout all departments so that the leadership at the university understands their importance, and we're doing the work together. We would always say, why reinvent the wheel? We make these decisions together, and there's strength, I think, in the numbers, having someone from every department doing these initiatives.
I think as a good follow-up to trying to rally other people, whether it's your chair, whether it's administration, or going outside of the department, how do we involve students and residents and other people of color in DEI without making them the face of diversity in our programs? And as a follow-up, did you ever feel like your race or ethnicity forced you into a DEI role because colleagues assumed you would be interested or have knowledge in that area?
I'm going to take that second question. So that happens all the time. I don't know anything about DEI other than my personal lived experience. I think Bernie just said the same. He learned a lot. It's a discipline. It's a body of knowledge. So I don't think there's anything automatic because you're a black person or from the Latinx community that makes you particularly well suited. And in some ways, it might even be more powerful for it to be a non-person of color in those leadership roles. But unfortunately, we become the easy target, air quotes, for that. So it makes me think about my wife recently, and she's a physician as well, and her department wanted to stand up a vice chair, and she was asked, and I said, she's like, well, she already has another leadership role, and she's like, what should I do? And I was like, was that ever on your top 100 things you always wanted to do list? And she was like, no. And I said, well, you say no, right? Like, you just say no, you're right. But this happens all the time, and many people don't either have the wherewithal and the fortitude to just say, no, I don't feel particularly, it's not of interest to me other than my personal lived experience, or I don't have particular expertise in this area. There can be a lot of pressure to do it, but she ultimately did not choose the role, by the way.
And I guess, like I said, I chose a role because for me, like I said, as I looked at the bias that my learners were experiencing, because that's where my passion was with learners, I wanted to make a difference for them. You know, I looked at going home to Louisiana, the healthcare disparities, the number of people that I taught me as teachers that I went back and saw in dialysis. And no one was telling them about kidney transplant. I looked at the number of transplant minorities. And so it's really just education for me to be able to make a difference.
You know, I think involving students and residents, I think students and residents don't really know how much power they actually have in making change. So if you're going to, I don't say use it, but that's one of my tactics is, well, let's get the students involved. What do they think? And I tell them, by the way, you have a lot of power, especially if you're organized in some way. I think back to 2020, so this was right after George Floyd was murdered. You know, this big social justice activity. I think about a group of 6 students who basically said, we want to meet with the leaders of our organization. And we have 10 demands that we have of the organization. It was the president and CEO of our entire enterprise, our chief diversity officer. It was the provost of the university. There were other people there. And these students, in a very professional way, said, there are 10 things that need to happen here at Jefferson. 3 of them we had already done. Most of the others we were working on. They demanded that they have a meeting with the key leaders, and they got that meeting with the key leaders. I thought, but I can't get together a meeting with these key leaders. If I said, hey, I want to meet, and I have these things that we need to do, they say, yeah, well, we'll get you on our schedule sometime. Yet the students were able to affect great change in our organization. So I think you have to let students and residents know that they do have power, that their voices are really important. Esther, I think as you said about the, I call it the minority tax, really. Well, you also have to have resources, people in place that will do the work. So what I do with our students and residents is, well, we'll take it as far as you want to go, but you got to study, you're learning, that's really your job. And then it's really up to us who have jobs in these areas to make sure that we do the work that needs to happen. So it's making sure that there's not that minority tax on students and residents, and faculty for that matter.
So one question that was, the panelists mentioned that poor or absent mentorship was part of their academic journey. As a chair who wants to do this well, what would you suggest to provide better mentorship?
Appreciate the comment. I think mentorship has been critical to my personal success, and really when I look at most successful people across industries, across life, mentorship is often the difference. And so I think of it as, in many ways, what do we really want in a mentor? We really want like ourself, like 20 years older, right, to tell us what's going to happen in the interview. I mean, that's really what we want, but that doesn't exist. And so it really takes a whole slate of people, in my estimation, that really can mentor you in all the different ways that you need to be. For me specifically, as a chair, I need someone who can mentor me in that way. As an African American man in medicine, as someone from the East Coast, so on and so forth. So it takes this whole group of people, and this is a dynamic group usually, because the mentors you need early in your career aren't the mentors that you'll need in your mid or late career, and that's okay. Now, the only way to repay the people that are in this slate or this board, as some like to call it, is to sort of pay it forward by mentoring others. So I think to answer the question specifically, so I don't think chairs make particularly good mentors of their faculty, and in fact, I explicitly refuse to do that because I feel like I'm conflicted, but I also feel like it puts favor in certain faculty and not in others. So I'm sort of everybody's mentor. But in our department, we've created, my vice chair for faculty development and advancement really spirits this. Every one of our faculty members is assigned at least an initial mentor, and we try to match up around interests and needs. But that becomes dynamic in and of itself as people get to know other faculty members or figure out this relationship would be better than the current one I have. And so that's some of what we've done in our department with some success. I think the other thing is, my research interest is in ED-based HIV testing. That's one of my research interests. And when I was coming through, there weren't a lot of people in EM who were doing that. So I also found mentors who were outside emergency medicine, and that can be a really valuable thing too.
We've done something similar in our department in that we start with onboarding mentors so that we make sure that coming in as a junior faculty, you know who is available, who you can reach out to, and then from there we will give you other mentors that are in your area of interest. And then I look at specialty societies. I found some of my best mentors in ADIM, people outside of my institution that I can collaborate with to forward the agenda of the specialty.
This is a question about training. So can you give some examples of trainings that can be taught at the undergraduate, at the UME level, perhaps at the GME level, or even for faculty development? What do doctors in training and all of us need to learn that they don't know?
So I'll describe what we're doing at Jefferson, because really, and we're looking at race and racism, what doctors don't know is we don't know a lot about this. It's a really interesting process. So we're weaving this into our medical school curriculum. So I think that our students who are going through their education are going to be far more knowledgeable in this area. When we do pilot program, let's test this out in residents. And it's really interesting to see that most residents have not had this education in medical school. So we take all of the things that we do for our medical students, bring it to the graduate medical education. Everybody says, wow, this is great. No, it's not above it's not below us. We've not had this before. And then you can imagine that faculty being further removed from whatever medical education they had as an undergraduate. I think you can do it. I think it's taking what's done in the medical school curriculum, bringing it to GME, because probably for the most part, residents have not had this education. And then it's building on top of that. It's making sure that you're doing something that's level specific, something that's a little bit more advanced, something that's specialty specific.
At the departmental level, I think you have to create a longitudinal curriculum. Currently for us, that's inserting DEI throughout the year. Ultimately, at some point, the goal is it will be infused everywhere. We won't have to say we're putting this in the curriculum. When someone talks about ACS, they'll talk about ACS with regards to race, ethnicity, women, etc. But for the moment, we're infusing it everywhere. Your simulation cases need to have some DEI focus. There are other educational virtual reality cases with DEI. We have special grand rounds where we're having rounds that look at bias. So you need to put this in place in several different layers and areas.
So in recruiting a diverse student workforce population at every level of the pipeline, one of the biggest motivators for diverse applicants is having a supportive landscape or space or environment. This frequently translates to already having a diverse and supportive group of faculty, residents, et cetera. So how do non-diverse groups overcome the recruiting action potential to develop a core, supportive, and diverse group in which to recruit?
Yeah, this is a really great question. Appreciate it. So there's definitely feedback loops at play at institutions around us, right? So institutions that have been incredibly successful continue to be successful at recruiting diverse bodies, because like people want to be in environments where they see others like them. And similarly, there's a feedback loop at the bad places, and I don't really mean bad, but the places that have struggled more in this area where maybe diverse candidates come through, but because they fail to see folks who are like them, they make other choices. So one of the things, and you know, I went to an institution where we were lagging for sure, despite the fact, and many people don't know this about Milwaukee, it's actually a majority minority city. When you add up the Latinx community, the Black community, the Asian community, it's over 50% of the population. So Milwaukee itself is actually an extraordinarily diverse community, but our student body and our residency classes really didn't reflect that, nor did our faculty. I was the first Black faculty member. In 4 years, we've actually significantly moved the needle in terms of, I think we have now 4 African Americans who are in faculty, a couple Latinx and other groups. And for me, so number one, I do think just probably my mere presence as the leader made a difference to many. But then early on, it's being really honest with people about like, hey, this is really important. Yeah, I'm sure you've noticed we're not doing so hot right now, but it's really important, and you could really be an important part of helping us move the needle to help create that critical mass where others will be attracted to our organization. So that's seemingly worked for us. We've had good results so far.
And I guess we similarly had a lack of diversity and wanted to move the needle. I agree, be honest, because it's obvious. I said when people come, you know, look around. In this department, we're not where we want to be, but that's not where ultimately we want to get somewhere different. Be willing to be a part of that change. And then use the other resources that you have. There are other departments that had URM faculty and or residents. So when I'm recruiting, I get people from outside the department to meet. If you're going to have a dinner and you have one URM on your faculty, you know, join with cardiology, join with anesthesiology, have a group meeting, you know, discuss together how you can change things. Discuss your community, the resources that are in the community. Those have been the things that have been helpful in me being able to recruit diverse candidates.
I think when Dr. Martin said bad institution, I don't know if he looked over at me. A crick in your neck. You know, so we're one of those institutions that is not, it's not diverse. It's not that we haven't been trying. Certainly the last 9 years we have. So when we sit and think, well, why would an underrepresented minority student, resident, faculty come to an institution? Well, we all think it's got to be a place that at least demonstrates, you know, a commitment that is really trying to show that they're inclusive of. So, you know, when we're trying to hire more, get more diversity. Well, how do we do that if we don't have it? Well, it's really, we focus on building that environment, you know, build it, and hopefully they will come. It's really demonstrating it. It's trying to get people to actually meet us. It's really very interesting when an underrepresented minority student says, I don't know, your numbers aren't so good, and then they actually meet the people, and not just other underrepresented minorities, but they just meet the people and say, yeah, really nice people at your place. So I think it's, you have to demonstrate that inclusive environment. Ava, we do the same thing. It's involving, so it's, if we just did the Department of Emergency Medicine, there's not a lot of diversity there, but when we have second look visits for students and residents, we involve faculty and residents and students from all over. So it's, I think, what do you do if you're not diverse? Well, I think you have to demonstrate that you have a true commitment. It's not just saying, we are committed to this. I hear we are committed to doing this all the time, but it's really, what are your actions? Do you have activities? Is your educational program inclusive? Are you in the community? Are you doing work in the community? that suggests that you actually care about this?
Okay. Can you talk about how you have either brought along faculty and staff who were the aggressors, aka Blue Lives, All Lives Matter shorts, or repeated macroaggressions, or how you've helped them move on or from the group? I know.
Wait, can you repeat that question?
Can you talk about how you have either brought along faculty and staff who were, and maybe they weren't really supportive of diverse DEI initiatives, let's say that, and how you either moved the needle through that, either brought them along? Anybody?
Well, this is like, you know, a really difficult part of our jobs for sure. So, you know, when I think about the spectrum of, well, I'm just going to speak to the faculty, there's just like the leaders of a spectrum of how engaged or not engaged they are with this topic. That's certainly true with the faculty too. And many times we're preaching to the choir. I think there is a middle group that's persuadable with data and passionate plea, but there is a group that's intransigent and like sort of no matter what you say or do, that's who they're going to be. And that's where I think making clear expectations about professional behaviors have to be stated and people have to be held to account for that. You know, it's funny, this is a few months ago. I know Dr. Padella is on my faculty, one of my senior leaders. He probably hasn't heard this story, but HR calls me. So it's always the same person. So when she calls, I always know there's a problem. There's no other reason. Never calls to say hi, right? But apparently, you know, in our institution, we have these recorded lines where people can kind of anonymously say stuff. But one of my faculty, you know, called to basically say Dr. Martin focuses too much on this issue. Yeah, like real. And she says, I sat on this for like a week because I didn't even know how to bring this to you. Like, I mean, I have to in my due diligence in the work that I do, but I know you care about it deeply. The institution really cares about this. And so we had a really good conversation about how, in some ways, why do we expect that the department is going to be any different than the city or the state or the country around these issues? I think sometimes we think because we're so learned and we have professor in before our name that we're somehow immune, but we're not. We're just a microcosm of all these other things too. And so we crafted a response to the person. She did actually, and I read it, and I said, this is good. I said, make one thing clear though, and Dr. Martin makes no apologies for prioritizing this.
So what Dr. Martin said, you know, you're going to get a group of people, and fortunately, in my experiences, it's a very small group of people. You're going to get people that they don't get it, and they're not going to change. So you get to know human resources, faculty affairs, legal. Unfortunately, they're going to be fortunately small, but there are going to be some people that you just aren't going to be able to do it on your own. So it could range from, you know what, it was a misunderstanding, you get the people together, they talk about it, and everything's clear. You hope it's that easy. And then there's a wide range of situations. And I think it depends. A suggestion would be, don't try to cure this necessarily yourself. You know, as physicians, we do that. We diagnose and we cure. And as emergency physicians, we're going to do it right now. We don't have time to go longer. It's going to be done right now. But it's also trying to figure out, where are your boundaries? And then it's getting the help of people that have expertise in this area. So it will be our student affairs deans, our faculty affairs dean. We have a dean of professionalism at Jefferson, so we might involve him. So it's really making sure that you use the resources, because each incident is unique and they require different resources. So in my experience, most people that are in a situation, it gets fixed, it's resolved, and that it could involve just a conversation, could involve education, multiple meetings, and then there's that group where HR, legal get involved, and that's really out of your hands.
I think we have time for one last question. I'd like to open it up to the audience if someone wants to come up and to one of the microphones. I invite you to come up and ask the panelists directly. Yeah, these are great questions.
Hi there. It's wonderful to be able to see the whole group together. It's awesome. Just be really brief. So, how do you address sort of the unfunded mandate that comes with the positions? Oftentimes there's maybe a vice president, vice chair, et cetera, that has on their plate to address this issue, but it doesn't necessarily come with funding. How do you do that besides the recruitment cost that comes if someone leaves?
Well, I'm glad to see some of my chair colleagues in the audience, and I think we all handle this in a little bit different way. There's a whole range, right? Some departments have literally nothing, and others have, vice chairs or division chiefs around this. And certainly, if you have a formal role, I'm going to guess that those are supported with clinical dollars, probably, or philanthropic dollars to create the time. But I think about the committee that we have, which we have a number of faculty. They're doing it with their discretionary academic time. So all of our faculty have, in med schools range from 5 to 20%, where there's that discretionary academic time, and we encourage them as a starting point that could be your focus, because there's certainly scholarly opportunity within that.
I guess at our institution, we feel that this is a priority, and I feel that this work can't be done without some funding. So I think from the top, the leadership needs to unite and fight together to get that funding for each department. Each departmental diversity leader at our institution has some buy down to do this work. We feel like the work is immense, and it can't be done without funding and buy down. And for us, we feel like the leadership needs to put their money where their mouth is. If this is a priority, it needs to be funded.
Yeah, I think if your question is somebody gets a title but no buy down, no resources, you could try, you squeeze it in here and there, but you know how well that actually goes. You can only get so far, and it's not very far.
Well, I would take this back to the wife situation that I made. Like, you should say no to that, right? Like, so for sure, I don't think there's any debate that if you're going to get a formal title, just like anyone else who has formal title, and 10 or 20 or 30% of your effort is expected to be in this work, your leader needs to figure out a way to fund that. My comment about the discretionary academic time were for the sort of the worker bees who want to participate on committees, and that applies to all faculty across all interests. But certainly a formal role, I would really push back, and if it were me, I would be inclined not to accept it, because that's a strong statement that that department is not particularly invested in it.
So we want to thank our panelists for such an engaging conversation. Thank you so much. And want to thank the audience also. These were some fabulous questions that came through the Google Doc, and we appreciate your openness and candor with all of it. So we thank you for this rich discussion and great start of the day.